for the most part, the contemplative tradition has not been solidly taught for 400 years. And all the experts are agreeing upon that. Let me give you just a simple little story that brings this home. I was able to give the retreat to the monks at Gethsemane. That's the monastery in Kentucky where Thomas Merton was a monk. And I had given them their retreat in 1985, and I thought I would impress them. It was a full 8-day retreat, and I wanted to show them how holy I was and how smart I was and how informed I was. And so the first 2 days, I kept dropping Thomas Merton's name, presuming, of course, this worldwide luminary, this teacher who's been translated into all major languages, would certainly be appreciated there in his own monastery. And then I noticed that when I tend to mention, as Thomas Merton said, some would scowl, and some would sort of grimace or look away. So the second day, I pulled one of the brothers aside, and I said, was Thomas Merton not popular here in his own community? Thinking perhaps it was that classic situation of the prophet not being honored in his own country. He said, no, we didn't like him very much. And of course, he's buried right outside, and people from all over the world come to visit his tomb. And I said, well, why would you not like Thomas Merton? And here is what he told me. He said, Thomas Merton told us we were not contemplatives. We were just introverts. You got it. And he was right. It was almost single-handedly that Thomas Merton pulled back the veil. And now the teachers have emerged in the last 40 years. He died 40 years ago this December when he was electrocuted in Bangkok. But in the subsequent 40 years, we have appreciated the veil he pulled back. Because he said the older contemplative tradition has not been taught for centuries now. He said most monks and nuns in contemplative communities say prayers all day. Or sometimes, unfortunately, antisocial people who don't like people that much, or who don't like to talk, or just like to be quiet. 5s on the Enneagram, perhaps, or introverted personality types. But that of itself can no longer be called holiness. That's why we named our center in New Mexico, I know some of you have been there, the Center for Action and Contemplation. And people ask me why I gave the center such a long and cumbersome title. And they say, which is more important, action or contemplation? And I say the most important word in our title is and. That's the art form. That's the absolute art form. Stephen's the director of our center who's accompanying me, and he'll be available for questions afterwards. But we've been trying to practice it for 2 weeks, going into different cities, different rooms, different people. How do you keep your center? How do you keep in love? How do you keep in communion while meeting new people, new places? It's heroic. If you don't know your center, if you haven't found your center, if the divine indwelling is not a living experience, I would say there's no way to do it. You just lose your soul to every new crowd or every new compliment or every new confusion, whatever it is. I usually lose mine to the confusions. Let me tell you one more story about that retreat. As I said, it was an 8-day retreat. And after I finished, the abbot asked me, he said, Richard, how can we pay you for this retreat? And I said, well, I'm supposed to be a poor Franciscan, and I don't need any money, but I would love it if I could live for a month or so in Thomas Merton's hermitage. I said, I've studied him ever since I was young and admired him, and that would be a thrill. The other one was to visit Julian of Norwich's, which I just got to do today. But he said, sure, Richard, just come whenever you want and it's yours. So when I came, he told me that out deep into the Kentucky woods, there were a few recluses. A recluse is more than just a hermit. The recluses only come in for Christmas midnight mass and the Easter vigil mass. Their experience of communion is not mass and liturgy, it's living in constant communion with God, just I guess as Julian did. And they said that when these monks appear at the door of the church on Christmas and Easter, everybody's waiting to see if they've gone crazy or they're glowing. And so one day I was walking in the woods and I saw one of these recluses coming toward me on the path. He was a former abbot, Father Flavian, a very holy man. And sure enough, he was glowing. Just had this beautiful, warm, gracious smile on his face. And he eagerly came toward me and he looked right at me. He said, Richard. And of course, when he said Richard, I was shocked and frankly a little disappointed because I thought he must not be a very good recluse if he knows who I am. He said, Richard, you get to preach. You get to preach all over the world. And he said, I don't. And so please, just tell the people one thing. And he pointed to the sky and he said, tell the people God is not out there. God bless you. And he bowed to me and went down the path. And I just obeyed his orders. I just told you what he told me to tell you. But unfortunately, the vast majority of Western Christians, Catholic and Protestant, still think of God as out there because they have not had any inner experience. And I think that's why it's so easy to throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's why it's so easy to remain dualistic in either-or thinking, because you haven't really experienced the mystery, which is always paradoxical, which is always a mixture of darkness and light. If you take, for example, the two great revelations in the scriptures, Moses on Mount Tabor, or Mount Sinai, Jesus on Mount Tabor, notice in both cases, there's the apparition, there's the epiphany, there's the revelation of a presence, and then in both cases, immediately it's covered with clouds. Knowing is always balanced by unknowing. And unfortunately, we have given Western Christians a kind of lust for answers, a kind of insistence on certitude, on closure, on resolution. And so we have people who aren't very patient, who aren't very compassionate, who aren't very tolerant. In our country, I just use this as a gross example. It's always easier to pick on a country somewhere else. But the very fact that racism was not seen as a major or central gospel issue till the late 1960s is an absolute judgment on the immaturity of Western Christianity. That it was not for most people a transformational system, it was for most people a belonging system. My belonging system is better than your belonging system. And so what we fought about was the container, and we got so invested in the container that many of our people never got to the contents, never got to experience what it was all about. Everything was the forms, the forms, the forms. My forms are better than your forms. There's the Anglican form and the Roman form. And we'd waste time trying to prove that one was better than another instead of teaching people how to go into the mystery. And that is always formless. It is always a mixture of darkness and light where I can't explain it with perfect certitude. It took Julian 20 years of sitting here in her cell in Norwich, England, to comprehend one night of religious experience. May 8th, 1373, it's supposed to have happened in this city. And she enclosed herself in that little spot for 20 years to try to unpackage what had happened to her. And if you read her showings, there's just this constant ability to deal with paradox and mystery and darkness. And she doesn't insist on certitude or answers. She can let God be God. I want to end this by giving you what I try to give to every country I go to, because I think it's the best thing I can give you. And even if you forget everything I've said in these 50 minutes, please remember this. Every year in late April in Santa Fe, that's the capital of our state, New Mexico, where Stephen and I live, there's an international conference on the convergence of science and religion. It's really, literally mind-blowing. And the amazing thing is that these PhDs, these scientists, seem to be much more able to deal with hypotheses and theory and mystery than most clergy that I know. For example, the one you've all heard. You know, some say that light is a wave, and some say that light is a particle, and they say, well, they're both true, you know, and we're not going to try to eliminate one. I wish the church could operate that way. Jesus certainly had no trouble. His parables clearly do not allow for simply one interpretation. As a Franciscan, I'm aware that in the 13th century, Franciscans and Dominicans were the official Catholic debating society. We hardly ever agreed with the Dominicans on anything. We followed John Duns Scotus, one of yours. They followed Thomas Aquinas. And there was the Dominican opinion and the Franciscan opinion. And you know what? They didn't kick either of us out. I wish we could be that way today. But where I discover it now is ironically in the people who we thought were our enemies, scientists who we thought were so rational. At any rate, one of these scientists that I was listening to several years ago also happened to be a Jewish rabbi. And in his talk, he said, you know, you Christians never really understood the meaning of the third commandment, to not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. He said, for some reason, you thought that that meant you were not supposed to say, God damn you. Well, it isn't very nice to say, God damn you. But do you know that's not even close to the meaning of the commandment? Vanus is emptiness. To speak something in vain is to speak it with emptiness, with futility. It's a waste of time. He said the meaning of the commandment, as it was understood for centuries in Judaism, was don't even speak the name. Don't ever in your lifetime pronounce the sacred name Yahweh. Never. And he said this gave us, at the very beginnings of the Judeo-Christian tradition, a cosmic humility about God. That once you think you've got God in your pocket, that you understand the great mystery, religion always becomes, he said, arrogant and idolatrous, where we love our explanations of God more than actually falling in love with God, where God refuses to ever be an object of the intellect, but is only known by those who enter into love and surrender. Secondly, he said, and probably a lot of you know this, that when you write Hebrew, you actually just write the consonants. And what it means to be an educated Jew is to have memorized the appropriate vowels and to know how to fill in the appropriate vowels in the appropriate places. I knew that from my short Hebrew class. But the third part is what I most want to leave with you tonight. He said, did you know that the consonants used in the spelling of the sacred name, Yahweh, are in fact the only consonants that, if correctly pronounced, do not allow you to use your tongue or close your lips. In fact, we know that the pronouncing of the sacred name was an attempt to imitate and replicate breath, that it was inhalation and exhalation. And then he began to do it into the microphone. And in a few minutes, tears started being audible in the room, in a room of PhDs. I now give this to every crowd I can because it can change your life. It can change your life. If I would come back here a year from tonight, and if some of you hold on to this and begin to live it and to experience it and to practice it, your prayer life will dramatically change. But notice, it has nothing to do with thinking. In fact, it moves the entire experience to the cellular body, corporeal breath level. And it means, wonder of wonders, that the first word you ever spoke when you came out of your mother's womb was the name of God. And the last word you'll ever speak, you don't have to try to remember, do I want to say a prayer before I die? You're going to anyway. That last breath you take on your deathbed will be the name of God. And it's the one thing you've done constantly. You just did it now. And you did it again. You're breathing. And you know what? There's not a Catholic way of breathing and an Anglican way of breathing. There's not a Protestant way of breathing. There's not an American way of breathing. There's not an English way of breathing. There's not a Buddhist way of breathing. There's not a Hindu way of breathing. There's not a Muslim way of breathing. We're all doing this together. And this wonderful God has made the God self that available, that democratic, that accessible. The gift is given. The only problem is the gift is not being received. We've made religion into a series of moral achievement contests. We've made religion into a bunch of hoops that you got to jump and about a bunch of forms that you've got to bow down before, instead of leading people to know something to be true for themselves. And you can see why Jesus was so happy with his cousin John the Baptist, who was filling in the valleys and bringing the mountaintops down and creating a highway to God. But we've created endless obstacles on this highway of the givenness of God, the availability of God, the humility of God, the compassion of God. But I don't want you to leave here tonight agreeing with me or disagreeing with me, liking me or disliking me. Who cares? It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. I want you to know something for yourself. So, for 10 minutes, we're going to sit in silence together. The most innocent thing in the world, and yet for many people, the most difficult thing in the world. It's so easy that it's hard to teach. Now, contemplation, second stage, is telling you what to do with your mind. And all I can say, because we don't have that much time tonight, is you just have to practice letting go. Letting go. Not identifying with it, not feeding it. Inside of every person, there's a great lover and there's a great wolf. And the one that grows is the one that you feed. If you keep feeding the wolf with negative, blaming, accusing, paranoid, accusational thoughts, your wolf will grow. If you keep feeding the lover by letting go of the wolf, largely because the lover is already there, it's called the indwelling Holy Spirit that has been given equally to all of you. And the only difference is the degree you have learned to draw from it. That's all. And that's what we're doing. So we're going to practice for about 10 minutes, just letting go of obsessive thoughts, compulsive emotions, and each time one comes and wants to grab you, just say, don't need that, don't need that. Knew who I was before that came along. I can know who I am after. It's going to be scary because a lot of us think we are our thoughts. So let me lead you into it with a psalm verse. And I'm going to ask you to repeat after me. And then we'll sit for 10 minutes knowing that someone else is going to teach us and guide us during that time. So repeat after me. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still.